This program is brought to you by Link TV for educational and non-commercial use only. Mosaic, a daily news program from Link TV, presents a selection of news reports from independent and state-controlled broadcasters from throughout the Middle East.
The U.S. President George Bush pledged to respond quickly to the recommendations of the Baker-Hamilton report on Iraq, which called for changing more than 3 years of U.S. policy in Iraq, and which all but concluded this policy has failed. Bush assured members of the group that the administration will take their efforts seriously, considering that the report offers a harsh assessment of the situation in Iraq. The American president is expected to meet with British Prime Minister Tony Blair to discuss future strategies in Iraq in light of the Baker-Hamilton report. Blair is anticipated to urge Bush to build a wider, peace-based policy in the Middle East to contain the crisis in Iraq. They are also expected to discuss the Darfur crisis and the war in Afghanistan. Commenting on the Baker-Hamilton report, Abdul Aziz al-Hakim, the head of the Higher Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq, said that the report gives the point of view of those who prepared it and that it does not oblige any side to take any particular action. In an interview with Arabiya, he said that some of the recommendations in the report are unrealistic, inaccurate, and inappropriate. He clarified that Bush did not ask him to be a mediator with the Iranians in order to achieve stability in Iraq. The Australian Prime Minister John Howard said that the coalition forces must withdraw from Iraq only if they are sure that the security situation there has been stabilized, adding that withdrawing under current conditions would mean defeat. Yasuhisa Shiosaki, a senior official in the Japanese cabinet, confirmed that the report will get the respect it deserves from all sides, and that the U.S. will carefully study the report. The Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert announced that he has a different opinion about linking the Iraqi situation to the entire Middle East, as recommended by the Iraqi Study Group report, which was presented to U.S. President George Bush. Olmert said that what he is interested in regarding the Syrian issues is what Syria will offer Israel if they return to the negotiating table. The Syrian Foreign Ministry viewed the Baker Committee report as constructive, especially relating to the role of Iraq's neighboring countries in helping to maintain stability in the country and achieving a comprehensive peace in the region. In a statement made before the beginning of the meeting of foreign ministers of the Gulf Cooperation Council in Riyadh, the Saudi Foreign Minister, Prince Saad Al Faisal, said the situation in Iraq is a danger to the security of the region, calling on Iraqis to stand together to confront the threats of terrorism.
You have noticed that the situation in Iraq has deteriorated and continues to represent a dangerous challenge to the security, peace, and future of the region. Therefore, we emphasize the importance of maintaining Iraq's security, unity, and peace, as well as halting all forms of intervention Iraqis have been subjected to.
استبعد رئيس الوزراء الإسرائيلي هود أولمرت إجراء بلاده محادثات مع سوريا.
Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert ruled out talks with Syria anytime in the near future. He said that Syria's efforts to destabilize Lebanon and its support of the Hamas movement minimize any chance of negotiating with Damascus. The Israeli Prime Minister added that he does not agree with all of the proposals made by the U.S. study group, which included proposed solutions to the Arab-Israeli conflict. Joining us is Dr. Mohammed Habash, a member of the Syrian parliament. Dr. Habash, do you find anything new in the Israeli Prime Minister's statements, especially with regards to the negotiations with Syria?
Of course, Olmert's government is a continuation of the government of Sharon and lately strengthened by Lieberman. So, we do not expect any positive outcome from them in the peace process. Now, they are giving us further proof that Israel does not care at all about the peace process. Syria, in fact, wants peace, but it is not going to beg for it. It has stood by its national obligations and responsibilities. The world should pay attention to Israel's statements about Syria's role in the destabilization of Lebanon. They do not mention what Israel has committed against Lebanon. Is stability in Lebanon threatened by certain political positions or by airplane strikes in the north, south, east, and west without discrimination between Sunnis, Shiites, or Christians? For 33 days, they destroyed everything in Lebanon, and yet they talk about Syria's role in destabilizing Lebanon. Who would believe this talk?
Sorry to interrupt you, Dr. Habash, but while Olmert and members of his government continue to make these claims, is it correct to say they believe Syria is ready to negotiate?
في الواقع سوريا لا يوجد لديها ما تخفيه تحت الطاولة. سوريا تحدثت علنا عن
Syria does not have anything to hide. Syria publicly announced its wish to pursue peace negotiations. We must remember that it was Israel that turned its back to negotiations and not the Syrians. We must also remember that the Israelis are the ones who insist on pursuing violent solutions like killing and displacement to conflicts in the region. The Israelis never responded to repeated calls for peace. We have nothing to hide. We are talking about public and clear positions. If Olmert does not see anything new in the Baker-Hamilton report that would lead him to change his policy, then we must keep Baker's statements in mind. If America listens to the voice of reason, it would have listened to these statements 3 years ago. There was no need to burn the entire region until the American president realized that he was creating chaos and that he was destroying, ruining, and demolishing, just so that he could get the Hamilton-Baker report at the end to tell him the truth. I am convinced that Bush knew these facts years ago, but his arrogance prevented him from admitting to the world that what he did was wrong. If it hadn't been for the Democrats gaining a majority, these reports would have had no effect. But now the Americans are compelled to deal with the facts, and I think that the Israelis are compelled to do the same.
ولكن الآن الأمريكيون مضطرون للتعاطي معها وأعتقد أن الإسرائيليين كذلك مضطرون لنفس السبب.
طيب دكتور، يعني سوريا رحبت بتقرير بيكر هاملتون.
Syria welcomed the Baker-Hamilton report. What role can Syria play to help get Iraq out of its current crisis?
لإخراج أو المساهمة في إخراج العراق من أزمته الحالية.
في الواقع استمعنا إلى كلمة
We listened to the Syrian Deputy President Farouk al-Shar''s speech. He clearly said that Syria or any other country in the world cannot end the crisis that the occupation created in Iraq. The occupation destroyed everything in Iraq. Let us help in putting out this raging fire in Iraq. The world must understand that what the United States did in Iraq can be considered a war crime.
Excuse me for interrupting you. What kind of participation can Syria provide and how?
من المعلوم طبعا أن القيادات المقاومة بشكل خاص في العراق.
It is known that all the resistance leaderships in Iraq have respect for Syria. Syria has received most of the honorable resistance leaders who are playing a positive role to liberate their country. Syria has also provided a safe haven for people who escaped the brutality of Saddam Hussein for more than 20 years. Syria has a clear vision of the problems in the region. The occupation is the reason behind the catastrophes in the region. The number of people who see it this way is increasing day after day in Iraq and even in the United States. Syria has experience in confronting Salafi groups. It was the first country in the Arab world that suffered from fighting the Takfiri groups. This explains why Syria has been able to foil operations planned by the Takfiri groups. This makes Syria's role very important in any plan to reconstruct Iraq as long as the occupation leaves. The historical and geographical location of Syria makes its role very important in the region, and it cannot be ignored in any future solution. 3 years ago, Bush would say that they do not need what he called the weak Syrian regime. Of course, he no longer uses this terminology. Syria has gotten out from a tough position, and now it has what it takes. Also, one cannot reach a solution and ignore Iran, which is a regional superpower. This is equivalent to putting their heads in the sand. Now the Americans started listening to reason. Unfortunately, Bush did not decide to listen to reason because he wanted to, rather because he has now been forced to after the Republican Party lost the majority in Congress.
U.S. President George W. Bush is set to host British Prime Minister Tony Blair at the White House later today for talks likely to focus on a hard-hitting report that urged a strategic change in Iraq. Bush on Wednesday received a report from the Iraq Study Group led by former U.S. Secretary of State James Baker, warning that even a sharper change of policy on Iraq may not avert a regional conflict. The two leaders should shoulder to shoulder on the March 2003 invasion to topple Saddam Hussein, have opposed setting a timetable for pulling out U.S. and British forces. But there are disagreements between them. Some world issues, notably over Bush's resistance to set carbon dioxide emission limits to cut down polluting greenhouse gases, and over the link between the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and Iraq. Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert said today that a resumption of peace talks between the Jewish state and Syria, as recommended by the high-level U.S. panel, were unlikely in the near future. In a report presented to U.S. President George W. Bush on Wednesday, a top-level U.S. panel said resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict was key to Washington's regional interests. The high-level Baker-Hamilton Commission said Bush's policy in Iraq is not working and called for an urgent diplomatic attempt to stabilize the country and allow withdrawal of most U.S. combat troops by early 2008. The panel called for a major international conference to take place between Israel and Syria, including the return of the Golan Heights to Syria, and to work on a final Israeli-Palestinian peace settlement.
The bipartisan Iraq Study Group said after nearly 40 years of war and the death of more than 2,900 U.S. troops, the situation was grave and deteriorating, and it warned the ability of the United States to influence events within Iraq is diminishing. The high-profile Iraq Study Group was made up of 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats and led by Republican James A. Baker III, a former Secretary of State, and former Democratic Representative Lee Hamilton. During a briefing of the report, Hamilton said the democratically elected government that replaced Saddam Hussein was not adequately advancing the key issues of national reconciliation, providing basic security, or delivering essential services. For his part, Baker told the assembled press that the Commission did not believe withdrawing from Iraq immediately was the right move, saying that might not only cause a bloodbath, it could also invite a wider regional war. On the highly emotional issue of troop withdrawal, the Commission warned against either a precipitous pullback or an open-ended commitment to a large deployment. The group recommended withdrawing nearly all American combat units by early 2008 with the goal of training, equipping and advising Iraqi forces to take their place. Though the group's report dealt mostly with proposed shifts of course in the war in Iraq, its key recommendations included a call for direct talks as soon as possible involving Israel, Lebanon, Syria and the Palestinians. Israel would deal with the Lebanese and Syrians on one track and with the Palestinians on the other. The report said the United States does its ally Israel no favors in avoiding direct involvement to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict. While calling for a resumption of long-stalled talk on all fronts, the Commission said Syria must agree to a list of international demands. It called for a halt to aid to Hezbollah and to the use of Syrian territory for transshipment of Iranian arms to the group, an allegation Tehran has denied. Earlier on Monday, U.S. President George Bush received the report in a meeting at the White House with Commission members. Flanked by Baker and Hamilton, the U.S. President pledged to treat each proposal seriously and act in a timely fashion. Still to come are options being developed in separate studies by the Pentagon, the State Department and the National Security Council.
In our top story, the Iraq Study Group report presented to U.S. President George W. Bush last night once again thrust the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to the center of what may become America's new Middle East policy. The report has already created shockwaves in Jerusalem for linking the Iraqi crisis with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. For its part, Syria welcomed the Baker-Hamilton report, saying that a solution to Iraq's problems could not be reached without the help of Iran and Syria. More in this report from IBA's Dan Diker.
Will Israel pay the heavy price of the United States' failure to create a stable Iraq? That's the central question that's being asked in Jerusalem and in some Washington circles today, following last night's release of the long-awaited Iraq Study Group report. The bipartisan report was presented to President George W. Bush by committee co-chairman, former Secretary of State James Baker, and former Congressman, Democrat Lee Hamilton of Indiana. Baker is well remembered in Jerusalem for his tense relations with former Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, forcing him to attend the 1991 Madrid Peace Conference. And Jim Baker, model 2006, seems not to have changed much. In his opening remarks last night, he said that America's future in Iraq is directly connected to the Palestinian-Israeli crisis.
Given the central importance of the Arab-Israeli conflict to many countries both in and out of the region, the United States must again initiate active negotiations to achieve a stable Arab-Israeli peace on all fronts and in the manner that we outlined specifically in the report.
But it was perhaps paragraph 16 of the report that caused shockwaves in Jerusalem today. It says that if Syria fulfills the demands of the international community, including exercising its influence to bring the release of the captured Israeli soldiers, a full Syrian-Israeli peace accord should be pursued. That would include, quote, Israel's return of the Golan Heights. In a press conference held earlier today, Baker and Hamilton expressed confidence that their recommendations may create a way forward for the Bush administration.
Well, maybe cautiously optimistic that the recommendations will be looked at very seriously, and perhaps a lot of them, hopefully, will be subscribed to. But the president, of course, is going to take the ones he can support and maybe not take the ones he can't. The Democratic Congress may take the ones they can support and not take the ones they can't.
Bush appeared more cautious in his approach.
This report gives a very tough assessment.
To be sure, the Baker-Hamilton report represents a complete reversal of Bush's post-9/11 Middle East policy. It is still a major question whether Bush will accept all or some of the report's recommendations. But one thing is clear. Israel may be in for a rocky ride. The Bush doctrine is looking more and more like an appeasement of Iran and its allies, and less like a strategy of victory over the axis of terror. Dan Diker, IBA News.
Okay.
Back in Israel, Prime Minister Ehud Olmert today rejected any linkage between the Iraqi war and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Olmert was addressing the annual meeting of the Council of Editors, a forum of the country's top journalists. Olmert also said that conditions are not ripe for renewing peace talks with Syria, stressing that on his recent visit to Washington, he received no indications from President George W. Bush that the U.S. would push Israel to start such talks. Asked about reports that he has met secretly with Saudi Arabian officials, the Prime Minister would say only that he welcomed the Saudi peace initiative, which he said contains interesting elements that should not be ignored. IBA's diplomatic correspondent Leah Zinder asked the Prime Minister for his reaction to the Baker-Hamilton report on Iraq and to other similar voices emanating from Washington.
One thing I think is clear to most Americans, that the problems in Iraq, serious as they are entirely independent of the controversies between us and the Palestinians.
President George W. Bush says, quote, "We need a new approach in Iraq that could include contacts with Iran and Syria and U.S. troop reductions," a day after a panel pressured him for a swift change in a strategy. Bush made a remark Thursday during a White House news conference with British Prime Minister Tony Blair, his closest ally in the Iraq War. A report by the bipartisan Iraq Study Group on Wednesday increased pressure on Bush to move quickly to change strategy in Iraq due to what it described as a grave and deteriorating situation there, with time running out to make changes. The report advised Bush to begin withdrawing U.S. combat forces and to avoid, quote, "a slide toward chaos in Iraq by launching a diplomatic push. Palestinian Prime Minister Ismail Haniyeh arrived in Tehran on Thursday for a 4-day official visit. He was welcomed by Iranian First Vice President Parviz Davudi. Following the ceremony, the Iranian vice president praised the Palestinian nation's resistance and hoped that the sacrifices of Palestinians would result in a mighty independent Islamic nation. During his visit to Tehran, the Palestinian premier is scheduled to take up bilateral ties, the ongoing developments in Palestine, as well as regional and international questions in talks with top Iranian officials. Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah vowed that the Lebanese opposition will not surrender in its mass protest to bring down the Western-backed government. He said those who are betting on our surrender are having an illusion, and added we will not go out of the streets before we achieve our objective to save Lebanon. Nasrallah also said, quote, "We insist on our demands for the formation of a real government and national unity because it is the only means to prevent any foreign tutelage on Lebanon so that we have Lebanese decision-making." The government of Prime Minister Fouad Senayora has reiterated its appeal for the opposition to return to talks.
مع تكاثر الكلام حول تقليص وجود القوات الأمريكية في العام القادم.
With the increase of talks about the reduction in the number of U.S. troops serving in Iraq, some observers fear that the country may become an open battlefield for a war fought between the radicals, led by Syria and Iran from one side, and moderate Arab nations on the other side. Meanwhile, Iraqi parliamentary blocs and political groups started to flex their muscles in an attempt to gain more political ground ahead of any gradual withdrawal of U.S.-led forces from Iraq. ReportAl reports.
يتخوف محللون من ازدياد احتمالات حدوث مواجهة.
Some political analysts fear that the withdrawal of the United States forces from Iraq may lead to an open war between radical nations like Syria and Iran on one side and moderate Arab nations on the other side. The United States has started to realize the importance of the role that Syria and Iran could play in Iraq. On the other hand, Washington wants to reassure moderate Arab nations such as Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Egypt that they will still enjoy its support. Having said that, President George W. Bush had chosen the Jordanian capital Amman as the headquarters for his summit with the Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. During his visit to Jordan, Bush reassured al-Maliki that the United States forces will stay in Iraq until the Iraqi army is able to control the security situation. This news came after the leak of the Baker-Hamilton report, which recommends a gradual withdrawal of the United States forces from Iraq. On condition of anonymity, an expert in Iraqi affairs said that the United States forces are serving as a buffer zone among competing regional powers, and should these troops withdraw, the country will turn into an open battlefield between radicals and moderates. Meanwhile, al-Maliki said that the Iraqi armed forces will be able to take over the security duties by the middle of next year. Iraqi political blocs started to flex their muscles in an attempt to gain more momentum and political grounds in anticipation of a gradual withdrawal of United States forces from Iraq. While the United Iraqi Alliance and the Kurdistan Alliance are trying to stand their ground, the Iraqi Accordance Front wants to be a major player in the political process. This news came after some regional countries have pledged support to the Iraqi Accordance Front. Nabil Muhammad Yunus, a political analyst from the Strategic Studies Group in Baghdad, said that the Iraqi government in its current makeup will not be able to counter the security problems in the country. He added that changing the government will not solve the current impasse because the problem lies in the structure of the government, which is based on sectarian sharing of power. Each Iraqi elected official or minister works for what best serves his sect or group, thus impeding the decision-making process in the country as a whole. Meanwhile, John McRapante, the United States Director of National Intelligence, warned that sectarian violence in Iraq has become a force unto itself, taking a different dimension that is beyond the control of the Iraqi army. He added, this may lead to further disruption of the country's stability as well as hampering al-Maliki's efforts of implementing political reforms. Nakrapanti said that in order to push Iraq towards democracy, the Iraqi political leaders must join forces and work together to solve their country's problems. They also must support the efforts of the central government, which is trying hard to resolve some of the political, security, and economic challenges facing the nation.
The General Council for the People of Iraq has organized a meeting for local residents and officials, including Sunnis and Shiites, at the Anas bin Malik Mosque in the LateAl neighborhood, west of the Iraqi capital, Baghdad. Dr. Adnan Dulaymi, the head of the General Council for the People of Iraq, called for the implementation of a security plan that will help protect the residents in the LateAl neighborhood. He also urged the Iraqi people to unite so that the enemy of Iraq will not find it easy to spread hatred and stir sectarian conflict among them.
This blessed meeting marks the beginning of our joint efforts to maintain security and stability in the Adl neighborhood. It is very important that the Adl neighborhood continues to be secure, safe, and crime-free for everyone, including Sunnis and Shiites. We are brothers who are bound by honor and love. We both, Sunnis and Shiites, have been living here for decades, and we have never had sectarian disputes or problems. We are one family, and our children are good friends. Our schools are not segregated, and they are open to both Sunnis and Shiites. We have never had Sunni-Shiite disputes in this neighborhood.
الشيعة ومن السنة لم يحدث إطلاقا أي نزاع بين أبناء هذه المنطقة.
In another development, Dulaymi called on the Iraqi people to unite and bond together, saying that the Iraqi political parties are responsible for the country's tragic situation, from killing and forcible migration to the closure of government and public institutions.
A killing spree has spread throughout the country, especially in Baghdad. This is very painful for all of us. Aren't we moved by this? Where is the religion? And where are our ethics and self-respect? Is this what Iraq has become? Today, Iraq is witnessing a sectarian strife. The Iraqi political parties are behind this strife. I hate to say that, but this is the truth. These political parties are supposed to lead people to what is good for them and their nation. Instead, they are teaching them to hate, kill, and shed the blood of the innocents. Where are they dragging Iraq to? Is this what Iraq and Baghdad have become? Baghdad, which used to be crowded with people, has become a ghost town. Life has come to a complete halt in Baghdad. If chaos and lawlessness continue to dominate life in Iraq, the result will be catastrophic. Where is the government? Where are the political parties and the reasonable people of Iraq? All political parties do not care about the unity and security of Iraq.
The views expressed on Mosaic are those of the participating broadcasters, not Link TV or its sponsors. Please visit linktv.org/Mosaic for more information about these broadcasters or to view previous Mosaic programs, obtain program transcripts, or receive the weekly Mosaic Intelligence Report. Mosaic is made possible by a grant from the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Additional support is provided by the Feyerdahl Foundation, the Otto Haas Charitable Trust, and by committed Link TV viewers like you. If you value this program, please send your tax-deductible contribution to Link TV, either through the website or the mailing address listed on your screen. This program was brought to you by Link TV for educational and non-commercial use only. Link TV is the only U.S. television network devoted to global and national news, with uncompromising documentaries and diverse cultural programs. Programs which connect you to the world.